Hi everyone, our presentation will be on the article Decoding Reveals the Contents of Visual Working Memory in Early Visual Areas by Harrison and Tong. Previous research has demonstrated three key findings to support the rationale for this study. First, visual working memory provides an essential link between perception and higher cognitive functions. This allows for the active maintenance of information about stimuli no longer in view. Second, research suggests that there is a limited capacity of working memory, such that it can only hold up to 3 to 4 items. Researchers indicate that this limited capacity for working memory may be accounted for by the findings of sustained activity in higher order areas supporting visual maintenance. Lastly, research has indicated that higher order areas lack the visual selectivity of early sensory areas. Thus, because higher order areas lack the visual selectivity of early sensory areas, it has remained unclear how observers can remember specific visual features, such as the precise orientation of a grating, with minimal decay in performance over delays of many seconds. An additional gap in research is that there's little evidence to link V1 activity to visual working memory, perhaps because these tasks do not normally lead to increased activity in the visual cortex. To start, researchers distinguished retinotopic visual areas of each subject in a visual field localizer experiment. Fixation was maintained on stimuli consisting of rotating wedges and expanding rings. The researchers established boundaries between visual areas that were presented on flattened cortical representations. These boundaries were used for the following experiments. The working memory fMRI experiment monitored participants' cortical activity while performing a delayed orientation discrimination task of one of two randomly cued orientations. The researchers accounted for the hemodynamic leg of the boulder response through trials consisting of a spatial pattern of timed average activity spanning all voxels within the region of interest. More specifically, two near orthogonal gratings were briefly presented in randomized order, followed by a numerical cue, either green or red, indicating which grating to remember. After an 11-second retention period, a test grating was presented, and subjects reported whether it was rotated clockwise or anti-clockwise relative to the cued grating. This experimental design allowed the researchers to isolate memory-specific activity. For each trial in the working memory experiment, they calculated the average response of individual voxels over time points 6 to 10 seconds, demonstrated in the gray region on the chart, selecting voxels from regions corresponding to areas V1 to V4. The activity patterns of each trial served as an input to a linear classifier with the cued orientation indicating the corresponding label. The unattended gratings experiment examined stimulus-driven activity. This experiment required participants to report whenever a J or K appeared within a sequence of centrally presented letters, while task-irrelevant gratings flashed on and off during a 16-second stimulus block. Gratings were identical to those used in the working memory experiment, but presented at lower contrast to elicit weaker visual responses. More specifically, fMRI data samples were created by averaging activity over each 16-second stimulus block, after accounting for a 4-second delay in the boulder response. To determine whether orientation selective responses for remembered gratings compare with stimulus-driven activity elicited by direct viewing of actual gratings, the researchers compared the similarity of orientation selective activity patterns in the two experiments. To do this, the researchers trained the classifier on one dataset and tested on the other.
The researchers investigated whether orientation selective activity is maintained throughout the working memory delay period. They used their decoding analyses on individual fMRI tie points in both the working memory experiment and the unattended gratings experiment. They first looked at activity obtained from areas in V1 to V4, and then looked at activity obtained from only V1 separately. There were 3 control experiments in place. Firstly, the eye tracking control experiment identified that eye position was not a reliable predictor of the orientation held in working memory. The working memory control experiment used randomly selected orientations to ensure that long-term memory could not contribute to delayed discrimination. Instead, accurate performance could only be achieved by maintaining the task-relevant gratings seen on each trial. Visual expectancy was controlled by omitting the sample gratings, providing only an initial cue to indicate the approximate orientation observers should expect at test. This ensured that the orientation signals decoded in the main experiment were reflective of the contents of working memory. For the working memory experiment, behavioral data confirmed that observers could discriminate small differences in orientation between the cued grating and the test grating. Observers showed equally good performance when the first or second grating had to be remembered. Pooled activity from V1 to V4 was highly predictive of the orientation held in working memory, which can be seen in the green curve on the chart. Notably, decoding was just as effective when the first grading was cued instead of the second, indicating that orientation information in visual cortex is held strongly, even when there was potential interference. As well, every participant showed above chance orientation decoding in each visual area. The main takeaway is that maintaining an orientation in working memory is associated with widespread changes in orientation selective activity throughout the early visual system, including V1. Because the gratings could evoke a strong orientation selective responses in early visual areas, as demonstrated by the red curve, the researchers found that activity in individual areas, V1, V2, and V3, were highly predictive of the orientation of the unintended gratings. However, performance was considerably worse for V3A to V4, presumably because activity in higher visual cortex areas are more dependent on visual attention. Generalization performance for activity pooled across V1 to V4 was below the performance found in the working memory experiment, as seen in the black curve on the chart. However, it was still significantly above chance. Generalization was also better in V1 and V2 than in higher areas, perhaps because these early areas exhibit stronger orientation selective responses under stimulus-driven conditions. Therefore, retaining an orientation in working memory uses many of the same orientation selective subpopulations as those that are activated under stimulus-driven conditions.
For both experiments, decoding of individual areas led to lower levels of performance. However, a similar pattern of results was found in both, as shown for V1 in the top chart. In the unintended gratings experiment, orientation decoding of stimulus-driven activity in areas V1 to V4 rose about chance levels within 4 seconds of stimulus onset and reached asymptomatic levels by 6 seconds, which is consistent with the slow time course of the bold response. Performance remained high as gratings continued to be shown throughout the 16-second stimulus block, which can be seen in the bottom chart. In comparison, the working memory experiment showed orientation selective activity delayed about 2 seconds, rising significantly above baseline by 6 seconds and reaching a plateau by 8 seconds. This delayed onset is consistent with the task relevant cue appearing 1.2 seconds after the first grading, therefore requiring more time to interpret the cue. More notable is that the orientation selective activity persisted throughout the delay period, when no physical stimulus was present, up until presentation of the test grading at time 13 seconds. Interestingly, this maintenance of orientation selective information throughout the delay period did not seem to depend on a sustained boost in overall bold activity. To describe further, the researchers' analysis supported the notion that the overall bold amplitude from a region was unrelated to the amount of memory-related information available in the detailed activity pattern. There was no significant relationship between bold amplitudes and decoding accuracy across subjects, or across trials for individual subjects. Thus, low amplitude signals did not contain robust memory-related information throughout the entire delay period. Using fMRI and pattern classification methods, the researchers found that activity patterns in visual areas V1 to V4 could predict which of 2 oriented gratings were held in memory. These orientation selective activity patterns were sustained throughout the delay period, evident in individual visual areas, and similar to the response evoked by unattended task-irrelevant gratings. The present results demonstrate that early visual areas can indeed sustain information for periods of many seconds, even when no physical stimulus is present, indicating that their function is not restricted to sensory processing, but extends to the maintenance of visual features and patterns in memory. As quoted from the article, these results provide new evidence to how early visual areas can retain specific information about visual features held in working memory. Essentially, these findings are significant as they show that when participants had to remember a precise orientation, this information was maintained in sensory areas, including the primary visual cortex where orientation tuning is strongest. Additionally, it has shown that although V1 is essential for low-level feature processing, there's an increasing evidence to suggest a role for V1 in conscious perception, attentional selection, and more complex cognitive functions. It is found that early visual areas are not only important for processing information about the immediate sensory environment, but also maintain information in the absence of direct input to support higher-order cognitive. Researchers are encouraged to further investigate underlying neural representations, as well as the prefrontal and parietal areas and how they contribute to top-down selection processes. Additionally, it is noted that in the future, researchers can look at the role of synaptic activity in the visual cortex using bold responses, as these are very telling for synaptic responses. Presumably, prefrontal or parietal areas contributed to the top-down selection process, given that participants had to interpret an abstract cue indicating which of 2 orientations to hold in mind. Assuming that the visual working memory are encoded by low levels of population activity, the application of population decoding methods could help to uncover underlying neural representations. Overall, as the article was quite short, they didn't list any limitations. However, if we were to pinpoint some, the low sample size of 6 participants, as well as various low p-values throughout the article, could potentially lead to the findings being non-generalizable.